itself hardly perfectible. End of quote. So we have, again, the position at its purest here, that with capitalism, finally, we found a social system which fits human nature. This has a certain human costs, because, again, sometimes people have to accept to lose their job and so on, and especially because our own brain, its neurostructure, it's not adapted to it. But, again, as he put it very nicely, the main task of ideology is to prevent people questioning the fundamentals of the system. Such ideological legitimization perfectly exemplifies Alain Badiou's wonderful formula of the basic paradox of enemy propaganda. The enemy propaganda fights something of which it is itself not aware, something for which it is structurally blind, not the actual counter-forces, political opponents, but the possibility which is immanent to a situation. The possibility, that is to say, the utopian, revolutionary, emancipatory potential. A quote from Badiou. He said this in his seminar on Plato on the 13th of February this year. You can find it on, it's available online. Quote, I translated it from French, of course. The goal of all enemy propaganda is not to annihilate an existing force. This function is generally left to police forces, but rather to annihilate an unnoticed possibility of the situation. This possibility is also unnoticed by those who conduct this propaganda, since its features are to be simultaneously immanent to the situation and not to appear in it. End of quote. This is why the enemy propaganda against radical emancipatory politics is by definition cynical. Not in the simple sense of not believing its own words, but at a much more basic level. It is cynical precisely and even more insofar as it does believe its own words, since its message is a resigned conviction that the world we live in, even if not the best of all possible worlds, is the least bad one, so that any radical change can only make it worse. And again, as always in an effective propaganda, this normalization can be combined without any problem with its opposite, reading the economic meltdown in religious terms. Benedict, the Pope, you remember, was expeditious in capitalizing on the financial crisis along these lines. He said, you remember, this proves that all is vanity, all terrestrial goods, and that only the word of God holds out, and so on and so on. It is sad to observe how, in the last years, my ex-teacher and good friend Jacqueline Miller got more and more engaged in this propaganda. There should be no surprise that the financial meltdown, the ongoing one, also propelled Miller to intervene in such a constructing way to prevent panic. This is a quote from Miller's comment on financial meltdown. I think it was published, I don't know, in Le Figaro or Le Point. You can find it on the web. Quote from Miller. The financial universe is an architecture made of fictions, and its keystone is what Lacan called a subject supposed to know why and how. Who plays this part? The concept of authorities, from where sometimes a voice is detached. Alan Greenspan, for example, in his time. The financial players base their behavior on this. The fictional and hyper-reflexive unit holds by the belief in the authorities, that is to say, through the transference to the subject supposed to know. If this subject falters, there is a crisis, a pulling apart of the foundations, which of course involves effects of panic. However, the financial subject supposed to know was already quite subdued because of deregulation. And this happened because the financial world believed in its infatuated delusion to be able to work things out without the function of the subject supposed to know. Firstly, the real estate assets become waste. Secondly, gradually shit permits everything. Thirdly, there is a gigantic negative transference vis-à-vis the authorities. The electric shock of the Paulson-Bernanke plan angers the public. The crisis is one of trust, and it will last till the subject supposed to know is reconstructed. This will come in the long term by way of a new set of Bretton Woods Accords, a council enjoined to speak the truth about the truth. End of quote. You noticed Miller's reference to Greenspan, who effectively was the non-partisan subject supposed to know of the long period of economic relative growth from the Reagan era till the recent meltdown. When, on October 23rd, last month, a month and a half ago, Greenspan was submitted to a congressional hearing, he considered some interesting points in answering critics who claimed that he encouraged the bubble in housing prices by keeping interest rates too low for too long, and that he failed to rein in the explosive growth of risky and often fraudulent mortgage lending. Here is the climactic moment of the Greenspan hearing. Representative Henry Waxman, chairman of the Oversight Committee, said, I quote, "I'm going to interrupt you. The question I have for you is, you had an ideology. This is your statement. Quote, I do have an ideology," Greenspan said. "My judgment is that free competitive markets are by far the unrivaled way to organize economies. We have tried regulation, none meaningfully worked." End of quote. That was your quote. You had the authority to prevent irresponsible lending practices that led to the subprime mortgage crisis. You were advised to do so by many others, and now our whole economy is paying its price. Do you feel that your ideology pushed you to make decisions that you wish you had not made? End of quote. And here is Greenspan's answer. I found a flaw in the model that I perceive as the critical functioning structure that defines how the world works. End of quote. In other words, Greenspan considered that when a once-in-a-century credit tsunami, as he called it, has engulfed financial markets, his free market ideology, shunning regulation, was proven flawed. Later, Greenspan reiterated his shocked disbelief that financial companies failed to execute sufficient surveillance on their trading counterparties to prevent surging losses. Quote, "Those of us who have looked to the self-interest of leading institutions to protect shareholders' equity, myself included, are in a state of shocked disbelief." End of quote. This last statement, I think, tells much more than it may appear. It indicates that Greenspan's mistake was to expect the lending institutions' enlightened self-interest is to expect that this self-interest would have made them act more responsibly, more ethically, avoiding the short-term self-propelling cycle of wild speculations which sooner or later explodes in a bubble. In other words, his mistake was not factual concerning objective data or mechanisms. It concerned the ethical attitudes generated by market speculations. Greenspan's mistake was to act on the premise that market mechanisms themselves spontaneously generate the ethical attitude of responsibility and trust, since it is in the long-term self-interest of the participants themselves to act with responsibility and trust. Obviously, his mistake was not only and simply to underestimate the rationality of the market agents, that is to say, their ability to resist the short-term temptations of wild speculative gains. What he forgot to include into the equation was the financial speculators' quite rational expectation that the risks are worth taking, since in the event of a financial collapse, they can count on the state to cover up their losses, which is exactly what happened, of course. But back to Miller. The message of his weird lines is clear. Wait patiently for the new subject supposed to know to emerge. Miller's position is here the one of pure liberal cynicism. We all know that subject supposed to know is a transferential illusion, but we know this as psychoanalysts. Why? In our public activity, we should promote the rise of a new subject supposed to know to control panic. Again, I find this a very sad position, which is people need an illusion. The only way that prevents panic is the illusion of security. You know, this is pure cynicism. Like, we know there is no big other, but people need a big other. So we should help those in power to construct a new big other to prevent panic. This is what I find so horrifying in it.